Let us get into our first keynote speaker. Enjoy, everyone. I'm feeling very emotional and proud of this moment, but let's introduce the first keynote speaker. Dun, 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 dun. We want to recognize this keynote speaker as a great contributor to the learning community, sharing his knowledge to help lift the caliber of practitioners around the world. He's one of the most experienced and hands-on design thinking practitioners globally. He's been recognized as the AITD Learning Professional of the Year and won eLearning Australia Prize for Individual Excellence, which here down under is a pretty big deal for you international viewers. In this session, you'll explore things like personas and jobs to be done, how to co-design with impact, how to get the most value for you and your organization. Over to you, the curious, empathetic, and self-proclaimed unashamed Aaron Pradhan.
What an introduction. I feel like it's almost a boxing match and there should be like bells going. So thank you so much for that introduction. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for the organizers of the conference. I can guarantee you that I will be the best speaker you've heard at this conference so far. And I really am glad that you've joined us today. So thank you so much. I'm just getting my screen sorted. 1 second. Yep, fantastic. So I'm going to be using, just to confuse people, I'm going to be using Menti today. I'm not sure if you've come across Menti before, but if you go to your phone, if you just grab your phone, or if you've got 2 desktops, you can do it via a second screen. So just grab a phone, go to the website Menti, MENTI.com, and then type in the code 258675. This is just a bit of housekeeping and then we'll be ready to roll. This will allow me to just get that immediate feedback from you throughout, and we've got some polls and stuff like that throughout the session. Just to be clear, I tend to use Menti. I don't think it's being used throughout the speakers. So most of the time you'll be using the Zoom chat, and I'll keep an eye on that as well. But if you can just, yes, thank you. If you could just go to menti.com, thank you for the first person who's made it. And yeah, just type in even just a hello, thank you, just so I know that you're there. And if there's anything particular that if you want covered today, lots of hellos, thank you. Yeah, please do say hello so I can see that you're there. Fantastic. Any particular requests or things that you want to cover so far? Templates and tools, love to hear practical ways to apply. Good morning. While you're getting sorted and getting on Menti, again, menti.com, just on any separate browser. So it can be on your phone, it can be in a separate window on your computer. And then just type in the code 258675 and you can put in a comment. First time Menti user, fantastic. Good morning, hi everyone. I should say that background behind me is not my background. I decided it was much easier to Photoshop a background than it was to clean my house. And having been in lockdown with a family of 5 and 3 animals, it was way easier just to Photoshop. Co-design tips, lots of co-design tips. Okay, fantastic. It looks like people are getting on and you still might be jumping on as we go. So I'm going to jump in again. And again, now on your slides, on your Menti slide, it might say up the top, it might say the presenter has changed slides up the top of your Menti window. And if you just click on that blue button and say go to slide, that way you can keep up with me. And what I'm asking here is basically a way to just judge, get a quick sense of where you're at. So if you can just rate yourself on the Likert scale. Firstly is about how much you understand about design thinking. Second one is about your ability to use design thinking, so your skill. The first one's about knowledge, like you might have an understanding of it. The second one, please rate your skill. And the third one is, well, how much do you actually use it? So it might be the opportunity. So you might have the skill, but you might not have the opportunity. And I want to be clear here that these are anonymous. We know I can't track who said what and so on. So please do be honest. Someone's already noticed down the bottom, you can ask a question at the bottom of your Menti screen, or you can add a comment. If you add a comment, it pops up on this screen for a moment and then disappears. I'll try to spot them as much as possible. It's more sort of just like a quick comment. And the questions, what are the benefits of using Menti? You can tell me that afterwards. See what you think about Menti. So we've got, sorry, I'm just going to put my screen out the way. We've got a few responses here. So we've got a decent knowledge of design thinking amongst the crowd. The ability a bit lower, and that's always the case, isn't it? You have an understanding, but it's still that skills gap. And then I'm surprised that quite a few of you are regularly using it, which is fantastic. So it seems like a bit of a mix. We'll jump straight in. Now, for those of you who haven't really come across design thinking, or maybe come in a really simple level of it, the way I like to describe it is by just getting you to imagine this picture for a moment. So please just imagine it was back in the days before we were in lockdown, and you'd just come home. You'd come home after a really intense day at work, and when you used to actually go to work as opposed to just jump on Zoom. And just imagine that you would walk into your house and you would collapse on the couch and you would just try to open up Netflix or Stan or whatever you've got and just start trying to chill out because it was such an intense day, like it went much longer and it was just really, you were pretty fried. Then your partner comes home and your partner walks in and they basically walk into the kitchen and you hear them shout like with frustration, and you hear them just like get really just angry, and you say, what's wrong, and you jump up and you see that the kitchen sink is a complete mess, and your partner turns to you and basically says, or your partner or housemate or some other says to you, I don't believe you've done this again. You've left the kitchen sink a complete mess. You basically said you were going to clean it, you didn't clean it, I'm sick of this. And they rush into their bedroom and they slam the door shut and lock it. And so you're left with this dirty sink, you're left with this problem. So being a creative person, you can do a lot. You can do a lot to solve this problem, right? So, I mean, just think now, what would you do? What would you do to solve for this problem? Have a little moment to reflect. You can add a comment if you like. Any comments there? Any suggestions about what you would do? You got this piles of dirty dishes, or how would you think? If you think I'm not going to let this happen. No one's biting, so I'm going to keep going. So some of the ideas that you might think of being creative. You could actually wash the dishes yourself. Obviously, you could also de-escalate and then solve the problem. Move in with someone who is less concerned about the mess. Outsource it. Yeah, outsource it. So you can actually pay someone to actually do the dishes for you. You could dam the environment and just buy plastic plates and throw all your crockery away and just, don't think about the future, just keep burning through them. Take a nap, buy new plates. Yeah. I like this one where you can actually go for 2 dishwashers at a time. So you're basically working in one dishwasher, and then when it's all dirty, you basically start in the other one and just jumping. You never go put it back into another cupboard. Move into another place. That's pretty drastic. Wash dishes immediately after using them instead of doing a bulk. Buy a dog. I'm not sure how that works. Leave it to hubby to crack and does it himself. Don't throw dishes in the kitchen sink. Wash dishes as you use them rather than letting them pile. So look, there's lots of solutions here. This is fantastic. And I just want to take a step back then, because another alternative is to actually take a step back from this problem, take a step back from that sort of anger, which is actually pretty hard to hear. And it's pretty tense, like everyone's in this sort of really stressful moment. And instead, if you actually just go to that door and you might try to consider what the experience is of your partner. And you might remember, for example, that your partner had a big presentation that day, or that you might realize that you've both been so busy that you have barely connected over the last 2 weeks. And so, there's other things that play here. So you might even guess, you might even say, oh, I'm wondering if you're really frustrated that, we haven't spent much time together, or I'm wondering if you want really some more support at home because you've been feeling so stressed out at work, and straight away, those were 2 needs I went to, support, or, it's connection, or, they might want respect. They might want a sense of the dishes are important to me. You not doing the dishes is a symbolism of our relationship, and they escalate it, But the point is, there is an unmet need behind that request. There's a request, and then there's this unmet need behind that request. And just say for a moment, if the actual need underneath that request was that your partner had a really stressed out time, had a really intense period at work, and they wanted some joy and connection with you. and some support, you know, some or respect. And now you go back to the problem, the solving, the approaches that you were taking, which was basically buying 2 dishwashers, getting disposable plates, just washing the dishes. You can see that you basically responded at a gut level to the pain that they expressed in the moment. And the solution that you went to didn't necessarily address the actual issue at hand, which was that they want more connection, they want more sort of support, or they might want more respect. You don't actually know. You can only sort of start to hypothesize about the sort of underlying need behind that pain. And I guess that for me it summarizes design thinking with a kitchen sink. It's about going beyond that immediate pain point, beyond that immediate request, and you're trying to actually dig deeper below it. So with that, I want to ask you, what do you, and again, you can go to Menti here, you can have a look at what do you think design thinking is? Do you think it's a mindset? Do you think it's a process? Do you think it's a cluster of tools? Or do you think it's an overhyped buzzword? And it can be all of those things, but just try to rate them as much as possible. So I'm just asking, I'm going to mark this Menti one as answered. It's really cool. Thank you. Marcus answered. And negotiate, that was back in that other thing. Yeah, so it's a bit confusing. There's this little comment box here, or there's the question box. They're the 2 different ways you can communicate with me as we go. So most people thinking it's a mindset so far, and not many people thinking it's an overhyped buzzword, but a few. A process taking a late run. A cluster of tools is pretty low. In fact, a process now winning out. Now we've got more people voting. So basically, most people think it's kind of a combination between a mindset and a process. To a lesser extent, a cluster of tools. And most people don't think it's an overhyped buzzword. I'll keep going. Thank you for that feedback. So look, I think, you know, where does it land? For me, it lands as a bit of a mix as well, like similar to what you're marking. I think I've seen it used as an overhyped buzzword. I've seen it used as a bunch of tools. I've seen it used as a process. I definitely think it has an element of being a mindset as well. All these things can be true and at once. And so, you know, this is the typical kind of approach or process focus that, you know, you probably would have seen elements of these before, that, you know, design thinking is about, you can start a project from being viable, which is a business need, being feasible, which is what's possible, or being desirable. And design thinking unashamedly starts from a place of being asking what's desirable and then innovates in that space. And then it works through this process. And there's different variations of this process. Of empathy, define, ideate, prototype, test, and refine. And it goes through these cycles of divergent and convergent thinking. So, you know, in that sense, it can be considered to be a process as well. For me, if I was to try to summarize it, it's about starting with empathy, and that's one of the crucial things. It's about, so you're starting from a place of really understanding your audience in a deeper level than you normally would. It's about designing collaboratively. So it's actually about bringing a lot of people with you, including the audience group, but potentially other stakeholders as well. It's about failing fast. So it's about getting that quick kind of feedback of an action out by using low fidelity prototyping. And it's about designing end-to-end experiences. So rather than just designing an event or even a product, it's about designing the whole kind of experience around that moment, I guess. So now that was my quick definition in, what was that, 15 minutes. Now I've got the rest of the time to talk about how we screw it up and what we can do instead. So let's jump straight in. So I'm curious to know, if you had to decide whether to use design thinking for a job or not, what sort of criteria might you actually consider? What sort of judgment, what sort of factors would you consider to say, oh, whether I'm going to use design thinking or not in this job? If you just want to type that into the box and just give me any thoughts that you've got there. Again, this is anonymous, so we can't see. Real outcomes, so is it going to get us real outcomes? What's the nature of the audience? If the problem is hard to define or there are multiple ways you could approach things, fantastic. Flexibility of the client, is it a complex process? Where it involves people, where humans are involved, complexity. A few people commenting up here too, client vision, deadline for completion, stakeholders confused or not aligned, and outcomes. Fantastic. I can see there's some old hands at design thinking here. If we have tried a few things and can't seem to solve it, that's a great criteria. Need and need to end innovative outcomes for processes. Yep. End-to-end innovative processes, solution-focused role, deadlines, what's the need? Fantastic. If you have access to the learners, fantastic examples. Look, I think there's a couple of ways of approaching this, and I did want to say the first screw up is using design thinking at the wrong times for the wrong jobs. And it's not always so clear cut. As I mean, I didn't disagree with any of the comments you had there, but for me, one of the key ways of defining whether you should use an end-to-end design thinking process, and this is what when I'm talking about the whole process, is you really need to know whether the problem, the audience, or solution are either complex or ambiguous. So, for example, I'll give you, there was a project where I was working for a vendor about 5 years ago, and the salesperson, the BD salesperson, sold a design thinking process to a client. And so, they sold it without talking to me. They just sold this design thinking process. Oh, it's great because this project's going to be really big, blah, blah, blah. I got into the room with the client, and it turns out that they were very clear about their problem. They knew who the audience was, and they already knew what the solution was going to look like. They already, like, to a certain extent, they knew the delivery platform. They knew a lot about it. And so design thinking in that context, like, there was a bit of work to be done to be understanding the audience, but really it was overkill for what we needed it for that particular project. Whereas other projects where even there was one project, one of my favorite examples of design thinking, where the problem was actually very defined. It was actually a compliance job for people who were, what were they? They were insurance brokers, financial brokers. So the problem was very defined. The audience group was very defined, but the solution was actually very open. The client who we were working with was saying, we're really keen to do something different. We're really keen to provide like a solution which hasn't been thought of before. And when we went through a design thinking process, even though these first two elements were quite clear, the solution ended up being, rather than compliance modules, it ended up being a tool which people use. These brokers ended up having a tool on their computer, which was basically a sales tool. And at the right moments in the sales process, it would have prompts for them to actually discuss key compliance issues. It would get people to sign off stuff. At the same time, it would have calculators to value add their sales process. So we basically created a sales tool that was by using this sales tool, which they all wanted to use because it made them more money. By using that sales tool, it inherently made them compliant. So we didn't teach them or train them about compliance. We just gave them the right tool and made a clear WIFM statement because we understood them more effectively. So, as long as you've got at least one of these things, which is kind of ambiguous, complex, or I guess open-ended, then it might warrant a design thinking process. Having said that, often it's more about using the building blocks behind design thinking. So the sort of toolkit, I guess, and thinking about what fits in and what doesn't. So I'm not going to go through these individually, but I will refer to them later. So before I go into the screw up number 2, I'm curious to know about your work right now, about just your work generally as a learning designer, as a whatever your position is. I'm curious to know if you can rate, again, this is anonymous, how much your work delivers strategic value to your organization and how much your work actually impacts behavior. It's a self-assessment and it's anonymous, so do be honest. So a lot of people are feeling like they're relatively aligned with strategy, and some people feeling like, ideally it impacts behavior. This isn't always due to yourself. Sometimes it's more about the role, so I'm not judging. And again, it's anonymous, so be honest. So that gives us a good flavor. So interestingly, you think a lot of people saying that their work is aligned strategically. I mean, the impact on behavior, it's a bit lower than we would have liked, yeah? And that's the screw up number 2, is that often I've seen design thinking more focused about learning rather than about performance. So for me, one of the key ways that we think about our industry and our work is that I don't think of myself in the learning business. I think of myself as someone who understands learning and understands evidence-based learning, but really I see my job as empowering people to change their behavior or adapt to change. or lead through change. So basically it's all about change. And ultimately it's trying to make an impact around performance to deliver value. And another way of looking at that is this diagram, which I've done previously, which I won't go into a lot of detail on, but really it's about saying, how does our work, which tends to exist in here, in this middle part of the triangle or the pyramid, how does this align to our business strategy? So everything's got to start from where the organization's going, you know, in those strategic decisions. Where will we play? What will we be known for? What will we achieve? And then when we know that strategic outcome, as learning professionals, as capability professionals, we have to understand what are the performance outcomes that are required to achieve this business strategy. So what are the specific measurable performance outcomes that our teams must deliver on? It's not just individuals, it's the teams must deliver on. And really the way they're going to do that is by combining people, environment, which includes systems and processes and so on, and working on priority tasks. And then when they do that, there's going to be these key challenges, and that might be partly around capability, or attitude, and it might be just partly about the environment. So again, you've got this split. And then in terms of trying to solve for that, like trying to make it better, you've got not just us as people who do L&D, you've got, you know, your 6 Bs, if you like. You've got your build, buy, borrow, bind, you know, so there's a number of strategies there where build, or learning and development, is only just one of them, as well as leadership and culture and reward and recognition and teams and collaboration. Now, many of us tend to play in more than one space down the bottom here, particularly in smaller organizations, ironically. Those in smaller organizations tend to play across a number of these. In bigger organizations, it tends to be a bit more specialized. But I guess to have this perspective, like any design thinking job, any job for us needs to have this, in my mind, this context. What is the strategic value that we're trying to solve for? And how are we playing in the context of other sorts of solutions? So we're not just building out content. That's like, this is trying to make us a shift from, rather than just building out the next thing of content and being a content factory, that we're trying to be strategically aligned to deliver value so we can help this group of people in this environment do these priority tasks, which is all about being strategically aligned. Obviously, there's other stuff like mandatory stuff and so on, and compliance, but really this is where we actually become real partners, and this is where we actually deliver value. So making sure the job, particularly if it's going to be invested around in a design thinking process, making sure the job actually has this investment behind it and it is actually strategically aligned. Okay, before we're moving onto the next one, so I'm curious to know how you think design thinking should be implemented by L&D. If you want to just have a quick vote on this, just to give me an element, and if it's not quite there, you know, feel free to add comments on this, like just by pressing the little dots on your thing. So most people combining with elements of L&D. So do you think, a few people thinking it should be going with working with like actual seasoned practitioners and design thinking, a simplified process, getting a late run, but certainly most people thinking it should be combined with in L&D, and I agree with you. I mean, all those things could be true. You want to listen to seasoned practitioners, you want to simplify, you want to just use parts of it. But really one of the key screw ups I see is that people are trying to use a design thinking process without really combining it with L&D techniques. So I totally agree with you. And look, my journey as well, I went from like being curious about design thinking, and I was an early adopter of design thinking. I went from being curious about it, and the big catalyst for me was actually having a major failed project. The failed project was, we were designing a blend for a large telco in Australia. I won't name the name, but there's only a handful of them. And, you know, I'd done all the evidence-based research, you know, like, for example, it was at the time, the evidence showed that in a webinar, most people started multitasking after about, I think it was 12 minutes or 13 minutes. It's probably down to about 5 minutes now. And so when people multitask, you know that they're switching tasks and you're not maintaining their attention. So we designed these 10-minute webinars, like these mini webinars. I can't remember what we called them even. This was a long time ago. And we basically, as part of a blended experience, and then we rolled that out, and then we were we weren't shifting the behaviors that we were hoping to shift. And I went in and just asked around about it. And it turned out one of the things that happened, there was a number of problems. But one of the things that happened was that the delivery team decided that it was too hard to run these 10-minute webinars. So they packed them all together into one 2-hour webinar. So rather than having these drip fed 10-minute webinars across an experience which lasted like about 2 months, they just hit everyone with this big 2-hour webinar of these disjointed 10-minute sessions, because that was the way they were set up to deliver. And initially I got all frustrated. I was blaming them, and I was like, oh, how stupid can they be, blah, blah, blah. And then after a while, after I cooled down, it probably took a few months, I reflected and I thought, well, I didn't understand their needs. I didn't understand what was happening for them or how they were set up. I didn't interrogate, like I just took the stakeholders in the room's advice to say, yes, this can be done this way. And I didn't go further. I thought I was empathizing a bit with the audience group at the time, but I didn't necessarily empathize with others and like provide and have a sense of the broader context. So that's what got me to thinking about design thinking. And I went into it very deeply, started to embrace it, started to explore it, started to learn it, got mentors around it and so on. And initially, because my mentor especially, he was not from a learning background. He was working at, he was heading up one of a tech company's design thinking studios. And so he had no concept of learning, but I thought that was fine. He's like a design thinker. And maybe because of that, I tended to, and most of my resources were more purist, I tended to adopt very purist approaches of design thinking initially. And I think this is the case of, most things when you learn them, you kind of embrace them to the letter of the law before you can relax into the more nuanced approach. And that's certainly what happened afterwards, where I tried a more integrated approach. And what I'm trying to encourage you to do is try to skip the purist approach to a certain extent. Try to start having a bit more of an integrated, playful approach to design thinking, rather than feeling like you've got to approach. It's not just this one entity that you can only do in a particular way. You can play around with it, and you can do it in a bit more of a playful, mix and match kind of way. One of the ways I've done a bit of the work for you, I've done this thing which is what I call the performance canvas, and you can get that off my website for free. And there's a video explaining how to use it for free. And so it's just a performance canvas, which basically it combines elements of L&D, of even Kathy Moore's action mapping, Nigel Harrison's performance consulting, with design thinking techniques. And it's even got some behavioral economic stuff around using nudges. It's got habit formation. So basically it's trying to encapsulate a lot of the bits and pieces I've used around the place, with design thinking really being crucial to that. You can see the persona there as part of a gap analysis process. So I'm not going to talk about that so much, but just to say, you're welcome to find your own way. But over the years, I've developed this approach, which is really a mashup of a number of different disciplines to try to actually put it in an L&D context as well. So hopefully I've done some of the work for you. Here's some examples of other things I use in the context of design thinking. So I usually use high value behaviors. This is one of my go-to models that I've used in the past. And this is trying to identify what are the high value behaviors in a job role. So again, you're trying to align up to, this is familiar. This is from that the pyramid thing. It's like the strategy, the performance outcomes. What are the high value behaviors in a particular job role or context? And you identify them by identifying, well, what's high risk, what's high occurrence, what's high challenge, and what's high impact. And each of those, when I'm working with an SME or a person or an audience member in the business, when you present this model, which is this is one of my go-to models, which I combine with design thinking. Another one that I use, which is this one isn't mine, and I don't know who generated this originally. It's a bit unclear. But the KSME model is what I use as well, which is when I consider blocks to behavior. Is the block about knowledge? That is, that they know, if you tell them about it, if they get information, they can do it. Is it about skill? That is, that it's something that really, the way I define skill is it's something really needs to be practiced. It's not just information. It's not just dropping a truth bomb and they can go do it. It's actually something that they have to practice. Is it mindset and motivation? So they might have the knowledge, they might have the ability, but they don't have the mindset and motivation. They don't care about it. Or is it about the environment? So that question I asked earlier, a lot of you said you had the knowledge. A lot of you said you had the skill. I assume you've got the mindset and motivation because you're here. But it might be the environment. It might be that in your work context, in your schedule, in your processes, you're not able to implement on this stuff. So this is one of the go-to models I also combine with design thinking. But again, I've just mentioned 2 of the models I use in the context of design thinking, but if you want to see a bunch of them, I would refer you to that performance canvas. Okay, moving on. Which of the following would be a useful audience question? Because we know design thinking is about engaging with our audience more effectively. So what questions do you think you would like to ask the audience out of these? Anyone going to bite a few of them? How do you like to learn? Do you like e-learning? What sort of training webinars do you find useful? What size learning videos? So a lot for that first one. How do you like to learn? Fantastic. And there's another question there too. I'm going to mark that one as answer. The broader, the better. That was from way back. Sorry, I missed that when it came up. So a lot there. And here's my screw up. This one might catch you a bit by surprise. I would say that a screw up in design thinking is asking the audience how they like to learn or what they want to learn. Yeah, it needs to be a bit deeper. Fantastic. But particularly these 2 questions, how do you like to learn or what do they want, for me, is a screw up in design thinking. And I'll explain why. Firstly, in terms of how they like to learn, there's the question of learning styles, which I'm not sure you probably already heard of, but this is my version of learning styles. And I would argue that this is as evidence-based as any other learning style out there. So, you know, you can be a classic learner, you can be a millennial right brain learner, you can be my favorite existentialist learner who learns best when not staring into the black void of the meaningless universe, or the ever popular Gangnam Style learner. I thought it might go out of fashion, but it stuck around, who learns best when riding an invisible horse while listening to electro synth pop. So the point here is that the nature of learning styles has been shown not to be a defining feature in how well people learn. So people might think they're kinesthetic, or they might think they're visual learners, but it doesn't actually impact on how they learn. That's the evidence has shown this. It's like the nature of the content or the form of the content should really be driven by the nature of the learning itself. So, you know, it might be, if you're trying to teach chemistry molecules, for example, it might be good to actually have like the actual physical blocks there. Whereas if you're teaching something else, then, you know, if you're teaching a concept, it might be better to have a visual infographic, for example, or a story might represent some complexity and so on. It depends on what you're trying to communicate to what sort of form you use. So again, what we're trying to do here, rather than saying people what they want, like, you know, if you ask that person, that partner in the front of this session, what do they want? They would have said, I want a clean kitchen. I want the sinks to be done. But we know that wasn't the real thing. People, when they speak to you, people are not usually in touch, both on a personal and professional level. People are not usually in touch with their actual needs. When they make a request, the request is kind of happening up at this level, but there's this underlying need below that request. And most people are not in touch with that underlying need. Partly because they're busy, partly because we're being reactive, partly because we're not trained in our society to think that way and to go to those places. So there's always this underlying need behind a request. And so when you just ask someone, like, you know, what Ford, I mean, this quote apparently isn't real. I made the mistake of actually researching it, but it's a great quote. You know, Ford supposedly said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have told me faster horses, you know, and instead, that, you know, it was about creating a car. So it's not always asking them what they want isn't really the point. It's what's more useful is understanding their goals. What are they trying to achieve? What are the pains and gains around those goals? What's the context and tools and workflow that they're experiencing? What are the communication channels that they're using to communicate right now? And what are their attitudes and emotions and basically their mindset and motivation around these sorts of issues? One of the best ways you can do this is by asking this question. Tell me about a time when, and you would have heard this if you've done an interview or if you've given an interview recently in the last 3 to 5 years, like a job interview, you would have heard this behavioral based questioning, which rather than just saying, tell me about your, like, can you do design thinking? And someone saying yes, you're saying, tell me about a time when you had to solve a complex problem and come up with an innovative solution. So tell me about a time when you're actually focusing on stories, and stories are closer to the truth because stories are what happened. They're not the person's getting into the person's head about their analysis of what happened or what they need. So rather than focusing on the request by saying, what do you need? You're basically saying, tell me about a time when, so you can help uncover the actual truth, and you can help partner with that person to identify an underlying need. And I can tell you, honestly, I reckon about 80% of my, I've got a decent reputation in the industry, even for jobs which I think haven't gone so well. And I think 80% of my reputation has come because when I partner with people, I'm constantly trying to find the underlying issue that's really plaguing them. And when you actually help someone shed light on an underlying issue that is the real problem, as opposed to what they were asking for, you are their partner for life. You know, when you actually go into that, when you knock on that door in that kitchen scenario, and you actually ask, oh, I'm wondering if you want to actually connect more with me, or you want to actually, you know, people do appreciate talking about their issues. I wonder if you want to have more fun, or I wonder if you want some respect. You know, this person was like all bunched up thinking about the bloody dirty dishes. And as soon as you make that suggestion, and you can't tell them what they think. You can't say, oh, this is really about blah, blah, blah. You have to be a partner. You have to help take them on the journey. I'm wondering if you really wanted some respect in this moment. And you'll watch it in their body. You'll see their shoulders just sink down because you've hit this underlying need. You've uncovered what's really at the root of their problem, and you'll just see their whole body change if you manage to work virtually with them and see them. So it's a real transformation in terms of the partnership that you can have. So those tell me about a time when questions, followed by a bunch of why questions, the 5 whys, which is a classic needs analysis kind of model where you're just constantly trying to dig deeper and dig deeper. What you can't do, no matter how experienced you are, no matter how much you know, you can't just tell them. Can you imagine in that kitchen scenario? Oh yeah, you're just frustrated because you've had a really busy week. This is not about the kitchen sink, blah, blah, blah. Can you imagine like mansplaining that to someone who's really in pain? It's not going to go down well. And this is where the co-design thing happens as well. You're not just solving the problem for them. You're being a supportive, empathetic partner who can take them to give them some awareness of what the real problem is. And that co-design, that partnership is crucial. You can see here, it's as relevant to build a relationship in a personal life as it is in a professional life. And I'm kind of flicking between the two because I just think it's really overlapping. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next one. What information I think you've probably got a general understanding of personas. I'd like you just to mark out what you think you should include in a persona in general. What do you think is generally useful? The broader the better. I'm going to mark that one as red. Love it. Thank you. Can you give us an example of the tell me about a time when? Oh yeah, so okay, I did a learning, while people are doing this, I did a learning strategy piece with, it was all about learning culture. And so rather than saying, like with a company, it was actually a legal firm, this was a while ago, and rather than asking people, do you watch videos? Do you do this? Do you do this? I would say, tell me about a time when you had a really hard problem to solve, which required you to learn new skills. And tell me how you actually develop those skills. So rather than just telling me, oh yeah, I like learning new skills through videos, they would actually say, yeah, well, there was this time when I had to present this thing to the partners and I had no clue about it. And what I did was I actually got on the phone, I rang one of my peers and they got me into this other relationship with this person who used to be a partner and blah, 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 you know, and you find out from their story what's happening. It's not just the opinion that's sitting in their head. You're going back to the story. So tell me about a time when blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, why did you ask your peer? Oh, because I felt like a lot of trust with that person. I didn't think they were going to make me look stupid. And this is gold, you know, when they're telling you these stories, like, you know, so what do they need? Psychological safety. They need to have a good relationship. They need to have a network, blah, blah, blah. So as opposed to saying, oh yeah, I like learning skills off videos, which is what they would have got it's like a doctor doesn't say to someone, what medication should I give to you? Or how do you like your tablet? Like, you know, do you want the tablets with this amount of stuff or this amount of stuff? They ask you about the symptoms, yeah? That's what we're doing, is we're asking those stories about symptoms. But thank you so much for this. This is great results. I've got to look around I've got these two screens set up awkwardly. So family situation, so big ones with goals and pain points, roles and locations, name, picture, attitude about learning. I generally agree with the ones that you've got. The one I would actually quibble about is picture. I don't have, I would actually suggest picture would be higher, but let's go here. Firstly, the screw up is using personas to stereotype rather than empathize. So one of the distinctions I've come across in the last couple of years, and I didn't use this originally, but I realized I was kind of using it without knowing about it, is challenge to personas is the jobs to be done framework. And you can Google it. It's basically a simplified framework where rather than looking at a broader persona or character, it focuses on what's a goal. So there's almost no person behind it. It's like a jobs to be done in terms of, you know, accessing a shopping cart would be wants to buy a new thing, or wants to like create this, or wants to do this. Like it's basically just the task. And then you look at maybe some pains and needs in relation to that, but there's no person behind it. And this, I think, jobs to be done was a bit of a reaction against some of the persona work that was happening, where some of the persona work, you were getting almost like these bios. It was almost like these mini series of characters. And I've done this myself. And in the early days when I was doing design thinking and I was getting people to create personas, I remember it was a government job in Canberra, and I had these groups developing these personas, and suddenly one over here, the woman persona was like she had a disability, she had a high needs child on the spectrum, she had all this stuff going on for her, and they basically, it was like they could literally spin it out into a Netflix series. And at the time, I didn't feel right to me, but I didn't challenge them enough, I think. But in hindsight, what I've realized is that a lot of these things are just distractions. So I think it's about understanding. I think it's about understanding what's the job about and what do you need to know about the persona. So sometimes a persona is appropriate because it allows you to empathize and to think through the situation behind the surface. Another time, a jobs to be done thing might be appropriate. So for example, it was 2 months ago, as part of a consulting gig I was doing, they wanted me to do this thing where I was talking to the team who was organizing Confluence and the wiki, and basically it was an information architecture job. And the person who was paying me basically said, oh yeah, get Aaron in there because he can work with you on personas and do this whole empathetic piece and do this design thinking thing. And immediately I went through my little criteria. Not a complicated problem, not really a complicated audience, not really a complicated solution. So why would I go design thinking? And in there, instead, what I did was jobs to be done. So I did it in an hour. Like we just said, what are the key jobs? What are the key tasks? When people come here, what are they trying to solve? What are they trying to solve for? And we just mapped out what are the jobs that to be done. And based on that, we mapped out the sort of information architecture from a user perspective, rather than from, at the moment, it was organized from a content perspective. It was actually organized through the organizational divisions. So it was like this division there, this division there. And it was, who cares? From a user perspective, you've got a job to get done. You've got a problem to solve, and you want the information which is accessible, which is, it meets the challenge you've got. So that jobs to be done framework in that context worked really well. So it is really hard to decide what to include on a persona and what not. Generally, I would avoid gender, race, age, disabilities, because what I found is that when you include those, if they're not directly relevant to the job, like if they're relevant to the job, include them. Like if it's about a job which is about young people, then you've got to include that, or elderly people, include that. But as soon as you say someone's 60, there's all this unconscious bias that this person's going to be bad with technology, or they're going to be a laggard or whatever. Or if you say the gender stuff, like, it's amazing when someone's got this female character and you come back to them and suddenly they're a single mum who's got to work part-time. And it's like, where did that come from? Like, just because they're like, so there's too much gumph in our heads, too much unconscious bias. So I don't go with gender, I don't go with race, I don't go with age normally. I do go with, sometimes I go with performance adoption rate. So I try not to use high performers in my personas. I try to target a persona around someone that we need to shift. And one of my go-to models is the Pareto principle. So I try to say, what's the sort of audience member that we want to actually make an impact? And I ask the co-design group, I say, if we could magically wave this wand and shift a particular segment of the audience, then basically saying what which group are we going to focus on? So you're trying to identify that high value target area group. So the question around disabilities and how it affects people's learning, and it's true. And what I would suggest is, rather than having disabilities caught up in personas, there's actually another accessibility filter that you use later. Like, you know, we've got a design for screen readers. We've got a design for like various inputs. That's a separate thing. I would separate that out to a persona work, because that's just like a filter. That's just like a requirement that we need to design for anyway. So yeah, I would separate that out. That's all I'll say on that one. So here's an example of a persona that I would use often. And obviously this can be done in depth or it can be done superficially. So I talk about the goal. So this is you. This is the persona I created for people who might be here, because I can't see you even. It's a bit scary. So I'm guessing you're a busy L&D professional attending the webinar. You've got a big workload, the goals. You want to get through the workload. You want to deliver value to your organization. You want to develop your career and work more effectively, because obviously you're at the conference and you've paid money for it. Pains, you keep busy creating training, content, responding to requests. So you're in reactive mode. You're being pushed to develop an effective training. Too often seen as the optional extra rather than respected partner. Lack of training and support to do things differently. So I'm guessing that's your pain points. Needs and insights, need to get through my workload. You get an idea. So this is about the current state. This is the way I do personas. I do the current state up the top, and mind Rita, thank you. And then, no, I've just been watching you. I know who you are. No, I'm kidding. So up the top is the current state. And down here, I do in relation to the change, because that's a different thing that, again, that, you know, often design thinking doesn't think. We're obsessed about change. So in relation to blah, what's learning, so in relation to learning design thinking, or in relation to attending this conference, in relation to whatever. And so then you can say, what do they feel, think, and do about the change? Feel is an emotional response. Think is the voice in your head. And you know, the voice in your head, it's the voice right now saying, I don't have a voice in my head. That's the voice in your head that basically you don't share with people, but it's that kind of cynical, honest voice. This all sounds good now, but how am I going to get the time and support to do things differently at work? And so what do? You listen and take down notes. Whoops, that's a typo. Keep half a mind on my to-do list, waiting for me when I get back to my real world. So, you know, it's just trying to get more empathy and understanding for people. And look, here's an example of a journey map where you might go through, you know, I really should reply to those emails first. How does Menti thing work? It's interesting, but can I use it? You're probably getting up here. I think I can get started, but it's a bit intimidating. And then you're thinking about that dip and back to those damn emails. The presentation seems like a distant memory now. So we know you're going to go through this dip. So how can we design for that as well? One thing I would warn about persona work is that avoid the Gordon syndrome. And this is, I called this after I did a job at one of the big four, and they came up with this personas and they called them Gordon. I go with names. I use non-gender names like that, Sam or Alex. So I've got a few of them just in the back pocket. But at the time they called them Gordon. I wasn't doing non-gender names. And I always do a stick figure. I don't try to show gender on the stick figure, but I've just found, and it's not data driven, it's more qualitative, that when you do the stick figure, people tend to create like more of a link to that person or to that person. But I found that you don't need to talk about gender or anything in relation to that. But when I did this Gordon one, and this group was laughing, and it was about, they basically created this persona around Gordon Gekko, you know, the guy from Greed is Good and everything. And I made them go back and do it again. And they were still laughing, and they made them go back and do it again. And the third time, that table was the quietest table in the room. And I went there, and they were all, one of them looked like she was almost on the brink of tears, because they got to the point of empathy with this guy who was so driven and so under the pump to earn money that he had to make all these sacrifices. So, you know, you just have to keep going until you feel a point of connection. If you're judging them, if you're thinking they're stupid or they're you know, or laughable, you haven't done it right. Obviously, it seems obvious, but I'll just go there. Okay, getting near the end. How should you facilitate a DT session with an audience group? Should you focus on accessing audience? So if you've got a group of audience members in a co-design session, should you focus that time on accessing audience knowledge? And how much should you actually share your own expertise with the group? I'm curious to know what your responses are. So big for accessing audience knowledge, medium for your own expertise. I say this because when I started, I tended to think it was largely about access, pretty similar to what you said, accessing audience knowledge. And I was pretty low on the accessing sharing my own expertise. I almost saw myself as a sort of like it's a bad metaphor. I'm going to regret using it, but almost like a midwife, where my job was to get the ideas out of them and to help them deliver their ideas. That was kind of what I saw. I have shifted. And now I actually am much more, I share my opinions more candidly. And this is screw up number 6, where you don't collaborate or co-design effectively. And here's the Venn diagram that I use to think about it now. The audience are experts in their goals, their attitudes, their needs, their pain, and their context. You know, that they get it. They understand that context. However, one thing that I didn't used to emphasize as much is I am still the expert in the room around behavior, performance, learning, change, and like myself and my team, you know, communication, marketing. So the question is, how can you actually get that balance? And knowing that you're not asking them about effective learning, evidence-based learning to do something. That's why the questions you need to be asking them is about their goals, their work context, their pain. What are they trying to do? What are they currently doing now? Like, what are their behaviors? How do they solve for skill gaps now? But you are the one who has more evidence-based knowledge around learning approaches, performance challenges, and so on. So I guess the warning here is not to put down your knowledge, and be very clear about what you're asking them for and when you bring your expertise to the party. It's not to say, again, you're not wanting to mansplain, but you're wanting to make sure that you actually are the expert in the room when this sort of stuff does come up, and you are able to switch from being that facilitator to the person who can actually offer some insights into, well, actually the evidence has shown that blah, blah, blah. And I'm curious to know if this is going to be useful. And that phrase I always use, I'm curious to know, or I wonder if. So you're not telling them, you're just saying, I'm just putting this out there. I'm just curious to know if, you know, because the evidence shows that, you know, that like by having these blended experiences, we're going to have more impact. So I'm wondering if, as well as having this webinar, when you hit back on the ground, you do this one activity, is that realistic that you could actually do that? Or what would be your experience of that? Because that's what you're asking them. So beyond that, you're trying to create a psychologically safe environment using Post-its, you're using visuals, and it's cliche, but it's cliche for a reason, because it's effective. And you're trying to save conversations for disagreements and complexity. And that's one thing I really emphasize. I literally tell everyone in my workshops that I'm going to interrupt them. And not to take it personally, I'm going to redirect them, because if everyone agrees, you don't want to be talking about it, right? You want to be talking about the stuff that people have different mental models around, about different agreement, like different views of, or you want to focus about dig into some of that complexity. Okay, number 7, what do you know? What do you use? So let's have a quick vote here, because I'm running low on time. Oh, in fact, I'm running out of time. Oh no. Okay, I'm going to skip that vote. Oh, damn it. So this is an example of the different areas that you can use, from pilots to prototypes to MVP and to RAT. And one thing I'll say here quickly is that I would recommend using a RAT. It's basically, it's looking at your assumptions test. It's basically looking at the biggest assumptions you've got for something and how can you test that out in the simplest way possible. Similarly, how can you prototype rather than pilot? So basically trying to avoid just running out with a pilot, because whenever you pilot, it's considered to be a finished thing, as opposed to prototyping, as opposed to doing a RAT. And you know, the RAT being the riskiest assumptions test. So basically, how can you test these things in a quick, low fidelity way, often looking like a sketch? Like, you've got to keep it really simple. The messier it looks, the more people take it as a prototype as opposed to a finished product. But once you've got a pilot, people expect it to be working, and it's just about tweaking. So my emphasis here is on prototyping and RATs. Similarly, it's lining up with a value proposition. So the bias to action is about trying to move faster. Like, don't think of design thinking as something that you have to go through in a lot of detail without moving into that action phase as well. So think cut through, think quick impact, think low fidelity. How can I just test something and throw it out into the world fast? I would love to get you to vote on this, but I'm going to have to move on because I totally mistimed that. So I think the last screw up is thinking it's all or nothing to get started. And my final words is don't just announce it. Don't say to people you're going to be doing design thinking. Just start using it. Check out the performance canvas. Work out ways that you can design more with your audience, include your audience in the design process. Use personas or jobs to be done, and use the model that I've shown you. Use journey maps. I didn't really go into them, but you can use them to describe current state, or you can use them to describe future state. Collaborate by being more visual. Embrace a bias to action using RATS, the riskiest assumption test, and low fidelity. And do stay in touch via LinkedIn and Twitter. And that's all I've got time for. The question was, can you give us an example? I think I did that. I'm developing personas to help me understand ways to help learner through change. Is there a risk I am not aware of? I think I went through the pros and cons of personas. I think the key thing is it a stereotype? Are you using it to empathize, or are you just putting people in a box? About elements for personas, you suggest location because the difference in cultures apart from technical differences. If culture is considered to be a key segment. So one of the key things you make when you decide around personas is what segment is going to be most useful, because there's lots of differences you could focus on. You could focus on height, you could focus on job roles, you could focus on demographics, you could focus on cultural backgrounds. And ideally you would mix qualitative interviews with some data to understand what's the most useful segment to go with. Usually you just need to have a hypothesis to think, I think one of the key factors here is going to be attitude, about whether people are actually ambitious about their career or not. And you play with that hypothesis with a persona, but you might need to test that later. So it's not like there's one right way to do a persona, but you've got to have a hypothesis to say, these are the segments I think I'm focusing in on. Would you remove the in relation to when creating overarching personas, not specific to a project? Yes, you can have generic personas, but have that in relation to which you can switch out and change depending on what sort of change program you're running with them. And that's it. Thank you so much. Sorry about the bit of a rush at the end there, but thank you so much for your time. I want to thank everybody for attending, and particularly the conference organizers. And do link up with me. Happy to continue this conversation via LinkedIn and Twitter. And hopefully I'll see you around. Love to hear your feedback as well.
Wow, wow, wow. Thank you. Heaps of comments here. Amazing insights. Mind blown. Amazing first start to the opening session. I've got post-it notes everywhere. What I've taken is grab the performance canvas tool. I've used it personally myself. Google tools to be jobs to be done, and empathize with your end user. So ask open-ended questions. The why, the goals, the pain points. Thank you, Aaron. Amazing beginning to the Learning Conference. We're so grateful. People, we will be back with you shortly as the next speaker is about to get started.
Thank you, everyone.